All right. Good afternoon, everyone. We've got a special treat for us for the CFC audience today. You know, a lot of times when you're looking at campaign data, you see the information for your particular charity or federation or the department or agency that you're the campaign manager for. And what we really wanted to do today is step back a little bit and, you know, take a little bit broader look at what's happening in the CFC, as well as what's happening with donors across philanthropy. And we have three very special guests that I've just been lucky to work with over the years. The first person you're going to hear from today is Woodrow Rosenbaum, and he runs a company up in Toronto called With Intent, but I've come to know him through some research work he's done on the CFC, as well as the work he does leading the Giving Tuesday data commons, where, as all of you know, Giving Tuesday is not only one of our two biggest days of collections, but it's huge in philanthropy after Thanksgiving. So, you know, he's going to share some of the perspective that he sees both in the CFC and in the broader charity world. And then we're going to hear from Dan Rashke. Dan is the CEO of a company called TASC with a C. And TASC is the firm that is the technology partner to the Give Back Foundation that built the CFC giving system and application system. But beyond that, TASC also helps run private sector giving campaigns. So we're going to get to hear some of Dan's perspective on what he and his colleagues at TASC see happening beyond the CFC, but also in some of the private sector, you know, giving that they experience. And then we're going to hear from Rosie Allen-Herring. And for probably more than the last 10, 12 years, Rosie's been, you know, the chief United Way motivation officer at the United Way, the National Capital Area. Full disclosure, I used to work there, but before Rosie was there. And she really, as the second largest federation in the combined federal campaign, sees what is happening right on the ground with not only the CFC and the federal workers in her backyard, but also in the private sector giving with their organization. So we've got, without me spending any more time, I'd like to pass things over to Woodrow to get his perspective on the donor trends that he sees.
Thanks, Tony. I'm going to keep this fairly high level. Feel free to throw questions into the chat as we go. I'm not going to go into a lot of depth on the CFC campaign. I just want to kind of compare some of the overarching trends to what we're seeing in the donation landscape more broadly. But as I said, I'm happy to answer any questions or go deeper, particularly on these overall and more micro trends that we're seeing in the nonprofit sector. I will share my screen. There we go. So as Tony mentioned, I'm Chief Data Officer for Giving Tuesday, and we build a lot of data assets and tools to understand what is the state of generosity and giving in the US and around the world, and try to provide some really kind of high fidelity benchmarks. And so from that work, we're able to get a sense of what the macro environment is for nonprofit giving in the US. And I'm going to share some of those findings and what we're seeing. I suspect a lot of folks will be familiar with some of these things, but I think that there are some misunderstandings in the sector about what's actually going on and that are worth exploring a little bit. So first of all, Giving Tuesday, in partnership with the Association of Fundraising Professionals, releases quarterly reports, which we call the Fundraising Effectiveness Project. And this gives us a look, really high fidelity look at what the donation trends are in the US. And this is what we've been seeing overall. So what the graph you're looking at right now is dollars and donors normalized for 2012. And what's pretty clear here is that the overall trend year over year has been for an increase in the value of donations to nonprofits every year, to the point where we're at almost 140% of the 2012 value, with at the same time an overall decrease in the number of donors. So more money from fewer people has been the dominant trend now for quite some time. There are a couple of nuances to this that are really worth noting. So first of all, there's 2020, which, as everybody knows, was a weird year. One of the things that was weird about that year is that the ongoing trend for fewer donors actually reversed for the first time in many years. So we saw an uptick in donors acquired in 2020. I'll talk a little bit more in a moment about kind of what was driving some of that. Some of it is obvious, but some of it is a little less obvious. Then the other thing that we can note here from this is last year. We have this situation with a consolidation, an ongoing consolidation, a heavy reliance on large donors to kind of prop up the sector. And what we know from our research is that organizations with a broad base of support, including from smaller grassroots donors, are much more resilient to economic uncertainty and downturn. It's the large donors that tend to be more responsive to those market shifts. And this is what we saw in 2022. So in 2022, after 3 solid quarters of dollar growth, we actually saw that last quarter under deliver. And so dollars were down slightly year over year by the end of 2022. And it was, in fact, in those large donors retrenching that we saw that effect. So this lack of diversification in the sector that is so risky, that risk is now being realized. At the same time, we saw a really steep drop in overall donor numbers in 2022 as well. And so this leaves us in a really precarious situation where we've been undermining the foundation and putting too many eggs in one basket. And now where we seem to be is that basket has some holes in it. So we're seeing that compared to 2021, we're down almost 20% on donors, and those dollars have started to recede. The bottom line year over year results for 2022 for individual donations look like this: donors down 10%, dollars off almost 2%, retention really, really poor. And I should say actually also acquisition really suffering. So all of the gains and then some that were made in 2020 were reversed, and we're back to the overall trend in reduced participation, but now coupled with less dollars into the sector. And so part of what we've been looking at is, what's underlying these long-term trends. It's a little bit easier to see kind of what the economic impacts are driving large donor suppression at the end of 2022. But what's responsible for kind of this overall trend, and how does giving and generosity look outside of this specific metric of dollars and donors to nonprofits? And what we see is a very different situation. So we get data a number of different ways. We get direct volunteer data from volunteer matching software companies, and we do surveying. So we survey Americans every week about their previous week's giving behavior using an instrument we call Giving Pulse to give us a really high frequency and timely look at what all of the trends in people's generosity are not just how much money are people donating, how many people are donating money, but also all of the other ways that people can bring themselves to leverage their generosity for outcomes. And what we find is that giving is, first of all, very diverse and pretty robust. The entire giving ecosystem is not showing the same kind of weakness that we see specifically in nonprofit donations. And first of all, one thing to note is that it is very rare for someone only to give in one way. The vast majority of people are giving, and most people are giving more than just money. And this is important to think about because as nonprofits, we're often engaging mostly in terms of a very transactional engagement, or we are kind of decoupling the fundraising and the other ways that we engage or tell stories or give people an opportunity to give. When in fact, what we find is that the way people choose to show up in their communities is a lot more diverse than just money. Also, what we see in the US and everywhere around the world is that only giving to nonprofits is likewise very rare. Most people are using more than one mechanism, whether it's giving to nonprofits as well as directly to people in need, or giving through some other mechanisms, organized mechanisms that aren't necessarily incorporated, like mutual aid networks. And again, what we see is most people are doing more than one of these things, and they correlate quite a lot. And also many people are doing all three. So and again, very robustly. So we see some of the same factors that suppress somebody's participation, also suppressing other or in nonprofit donations, that those same factors can suppress the other ways that people show up and give. But the biggest factor here is whether people are kind of invited to participate, because by and large, people are participating in giving, and that is not showing the same kind of weakness as nonprofit participation. And, you know, one of the things we hear a lot in the sector is kind of fear of competition. And I think actually that scarcity mentality is holding back the sector in a lot of ways. And it tends to drive us toward practices that are not particularly effective. What we find, in fact, is that giving mechanisms and modes are not particularly competitive. They're much more generative or mutually supportive than that. The best indicator that somebody's going to take some action for good is that they've taken some other action for good. So there is some nuance here. People who participate in mutual aid support in the US are more likely to say that they prefer to give directly to a person in need rather than to a nonprofit organization. Which is true, that is their preference, but they're also more likely to donate to a charity than their peers. And what we find is that people who give directly to individual crowdfunding campaigns are also more likely to give to a charity. They're also more likely to say that they enjoy giving and that it's important to give back and that they trust nonprofits. So we are in this environment where there's actually quite a bit of abundance and opportunity, and yet a lot of organizations are using tactics and strategies that assume the opposite. And I think that that's one of the things that is holding back the sector from getting that broad participation. So then some high-level results, you know, what we saw in the CFC campaign and how that relates, that we're seeing some similar trends here. So for example, we're seeing a decline in the total amount that was donated. We're also seeing a decline in participation. Now, a lot of this, as you'll see, has to do with paper pledging. And I think this is one of the things that the campaign is going to have to navigate if we're going to have some success or reverse some of these negative trends. Last year, we saw declines across the board. And interestingly, the dollars were down almost 11%. Participation was down almost 20%. And so this is important because that consolidation trend really undermines resilience, and that also that lack of diversification introduces a lot of risk. And you'll recall that is exactly the trend that we're seeing in the overall marketplace prior to 2022's dollar decline, was that consolidation. So this is increasingly a reliance on too few donors, and of course an overall drop as well. As I said, this paper pledging really was a significant component of this drop. So I think we're looking at about 21% of the decline is attributable to a drop in paper pledging. And we also saw that result repeated with volunteering. And so this is, although not quite to the same extent. So we're not getting mechanisms to replace this paper pledging at a rate that's going to sort of fill that hole. That said, there are a number of opportunities that are clear from last year's campaign. Retirees really showing a completely different trend. And I think understanding what that opportunity is important. Where we are seeing a return back to volunteering, I think having a lot to do with more opportunities now and less of a COVID effect of that certainly continuing to dwindle, which is an important opportunity because not only is there a strong correlation between volunteering and donation in the CFC campaign, overall, we see this very strongly, and recent research at the University of Maryland suggests that volunteering actually is the more important driver of donation rather than the other way around. So I think there's an opportunity here as well. And giving moments. And this is really important to understand, like acquisition is one of the really one of the real weaknesses in the campaign over the last couple of years. Giving moments drive acquisition. And what we see within the CFC context is that we see special solicitation really delivering on acquisition. And we saw that throughout 2020. That acquisition year overall in the sector was really driven by giving moments, some of them very COVID driven, but not always, like racial justice driving a lot of acquisition. Giving Tuesday, incidentally, is the single biggest day for donor acquisition all year round, including in a year where everything is up. So thinking about how we can leverage those moments is really critical because we see them show up in the results. And although some of that is necessarily reactionary, there's a crisis in the world that drives acquisition and participation. We can create giving moments around themes with collaboration. So there's lots of opportunity there if we look at it, particularly if we couple this with this growth in volunteering. This is just an indicator of what we're talking about when we think about moments. So we saw decreasing pledges in 2022, but international charity saw this 80% increase, right? And so this very focused on Ukraine, we see this very clearly in the overall data as well, where these moments of action drive a lot more people in. The trick, of course, is how do you then keep them engaged? And we can't just think about this in terms of, oh, then we'll put them in an old school standard donor stewardship model. But the acquisition weakness itself, we have a prescription for that, and it's really important to get in there. And then I think, related to that, thinking about retirees, as here we've got an opportunity with the other end of the equation, a group that are being retained at high rates and are delivering, really bucking that decline trend. What are the opportunities for engaging these donors more often? I think that together what we see is that if we think about those retirees who are in so many ways the mainstay of this program and really providing an opportunity, how do we ensure that we continue to drive that? We need replacements for this paper pledging approach. We need to think about where paper pledging is just required in order to maintain the campaign performance, because if we don't dial that in, there isn't going to be a replacement. That hole is just never going to get filled. And volunteering, again, one of the bright spots right now being that volunteering opportunity, and knowing that it can drive donation and retention. We should think about how we can increase those opportunities. All right, so I tried to get all that done within my time frame. Let's see if there are any questions. Is the downward trend consistent across all federal departments? No, they're not. I know that I don't have the total stats in front of me right now. They're not. So DOD in particular suffered from paper pledging, I know, and that where we see the differences tended to be related to how dependent on paper pledging a particular department was. Other than that, I think that there aren't any really what I would call clear trends.
Postal Service also, Woodrow, DoD, yeah. Postal, both, yeah.
Any other questions? So somebody was a little confused and thought the session was over at 3. No, we're still here.
We're still here. Okay.
Lots more learning coming.
we will have a chance to come back and ask more questions. Someone does say, what is considered a paper pledge? You know, CFC has an online giving system, but people who don't access that could still use a paper form and mail a check to our central campaign administrator in Madison, Wisconsin, where Dan Rashke is the CEO. And now we're going to have a chance to hear a little bit from Dan about what he and his colleagues at TASC are seeing happening in the world of philanthropy. So Woodrow,
Tony, just before we get on that, I want to underline this paper pledging thing, because I think this is more than just a how do we get people to convert to digital. There's a couple of things going on here, right? One is that some of these departments and the way they work, postal service in particular, right, just lend themselves better to paper. If you've got a large body of your workforce that aren't spending time in front of the computer, then there's less of an opportunity there. But the other component of this is that the technology is not as important as the engagement, and paper pledging by its nature is more personal and is more likely to be happening with direct personal engagement. So it's not that you can't replicate that with online engagement tools. What's important to recognize is that what you were replacing is not the form. What you have to think about is we need to figure out how to replace the engagement, or at least augment the engagement with digital engagement, because it's not the technical mechanism that matters as much. And what we're missing out on is that personal engagement that is a component of that paper pledging. Sorry, Tony, I will let you.
Those are great points. A great distinction, and thank you for making that. And again, we will have chance to, there are a few more questions coming into the chat, and we will come back to some of those. But Dan, I'm going to turn over to you, and feel free to pick up where we've left you.
Yeah, so a couple things. Thanks everybody for joining, and thank you, Tony, for the opportunity. Again, Dan Rashke with TASC. Tony did a nice job at the beginning to clarify, and probably going to re-clarify because there was a slide there. So the CCA, the Central Campaign Administrator, is the Give Back Foundation. So they're the primary. We would be a subcontractor of theirs, but a critical piece of our role is the production and maintenance of the technology that addresses both the charity side of the equation, getting in and up and listed, as well as the pledging side. So I'll make a couple comments about the recent exchange regarding the paper pledge. I do think Woodrow's onto something there. The engagement isn't about the device, it's really about the engagement of the individual. However, I do think we can go further with the mobile app, because if the vehicle of paper values the fact that a person is not able to sit down and get in front of the PC like we are, then maybe an alternative to the paper would be the mobile app. A little anecdote: in my regular day job, when I'm not participating in supporting the Give Back Foundation or doing other active philanthropy work or other efforts with our company to support organizations in their giving campaigns, we do about 55 various accounts in our administration, medical, daycare, whatever. As an example, one of our contracts is the letter carriers. So that's not the USPS, that's the letter carriers through the union. And we're having tremendous success reaching them with an account and a reimbursement of certain expenses using the mobile app in place. So I think there's some opportunities. We could probably do some strategic discussions around that and see where that might take us. My comments are going to be more of a mashup of data. I'm certainly not going to dazzle you with following a data analyst in Woodrow. He's done a great job and clearly knows his stuff and is very capable. So I'm going to kind of take data, maybe mash it up with some anecdotal and bring in my experiences, almost like 3 sites of bearing. So first of all, the data out in the general population, there's a lot of organizations that produce quality data. I did make note of the University of Maryland. I was not familiar with them, but obviously Lilly School out of Indiana University with Giving USA, you've got the fundraising report, fundraising effectiveness, you got the community involvement study, Center of Corporate Citizenship with the Carroll School of Management in Boston College, in addition to some of the data we can get our hands on. But those sources are pretty good resources. One of the things I found is there's a lack of disaggregation. You know, when we talk about the individual donor, take Giving USA as an example, it's just one big fat pot of individual donors. I think Woodrow was onto something earlier about the large donors and how market shifts will affect them. You'll see in the reports sometimes they'll look at the trends in donations, and then they'll look at it and do it, you know, inflation adjusted, or they might do it based on current dollars. I think one of the things that'd be great if we could find a resource that would peel that onion back, disaggregate, and maybe even look at some of the donation related to market increases. So if you've got a large chunk of your individual donors are retired baby boomers controlling a lot of the wealth, or you've got mega donors, and if the market trends is showing you influences of behavior, there's a real good chance that once you peel that onion back, that's a population that is maybe holding the individuals up. The individuals, I think, are falling in their donating, nothing new, but I think they're falling at a greater rate, those in the workplace, at a greater rate than what Giving USA talks about. So they might talk about individual going down 3.4% or 10 points if it's adjusted for inflation. And then that individual piece represents 64% of the pie. It used to be well over 70, and it's times at 80% of the pie. And they talk about in current dollars, you know, it's always been flat or going up except for 4 years, 87, the big crash, 07, 08, the Great Recession, and then now here in 2022. So that's a little bit of a head scratcher, but I think there's been an underlying trend that, as Woodrow said, is now starting to show itself because the individual donations have been masked a little bit by some of the bigger donations in that regard. So, you know, individuals, high net worth, retirees, baby boomers is a key piece. So my experience and anecdotal tells me that there's more there to be seen that is not seen. I've been active for many years with my local United Way. I know we have another great representative of United Way following us, local in Dane County. And I was a campaign chair, and I worked with that organization. And in our recent conversations, the CEO over there and I had talked about some of the trends and what's occurring, and seeing kind of that erosion in the workplace giving. Now, with that said, not everything is all doomsday from that standpoint. Then the donor advised funds was mentioned. What's happening a little bit in the data, it's hard to see people's behavior on monies literally getting out there, and it's a combination of tax reform, because some of your larger donors, and I work with businesses where I'll appeal to them relative to creating a giving program. Sometimes you got to appeal to the executives, and then I'll talk to them about how they can give and take advantage of taxes with a donor advised fund as an example. Again, it's high net worth who are maybe aggregating 3 years of contribution into 1 year, and then with kind of quantitative easing is moving that money out. But that could be a driver for why Giving USA talks about the uptick in the donor advised funds out there. And it does affect the ability, again, to see year over year what's really going on from a giving perspective. Some observations, movement by employers toward more of a consumerism kind of an approach where there's more freedom and control. It's kind of desired by the individual. Very similar to what we've seen with retirement benefits or healthcare benefits, less employer involvement, less steering. Kind of need to meet the donor where they're at. Woodrow talked about that a little bit. I use different words, but probably sending the same message, multi-channel giving methods, multi-choice and charities and causes, and that time event-based kind of cause-based trigger. And I think that's an area where CFC has continued to make movement in a good way to try to find ways to further within the jurisdiction of what they can do to meet the donor where they're at with channels and different kind of funding methods and reasons to fund. Cause giving with monetary and volunteer elements is on the rise. There's kind of this element of cause and confidence. People want to know where their dollars are going. More volunteerism and more paid off. A little riff on TASC. Back in the day, we decided to do paid volunteer for our employees, and we did 40 hours, a full week of paid volunteer. And a lot of people couldn't believe it. A lot of employers wouldn't go that route. Well, now when I talk to other business leaders and employers, there's more and more of paid volunteerism. And I think it's great. It's trying to create an environment to get the volunteerism connected to their giving. And I think that University of Maryland report, which I was not aware of, I'm going to be very interested in, that Woodrow spoke of. And then I think there's more of the tracking of volunteerism with things like dollar per doers for people outside. We're seeing that outside of work when they're giving. And you could see the influence of cause giving. Look at, the movement toward international, whether it's Giving USA or Woodrow's comments in Ukraine. There's that compelling reason. Maybe in that case, volunteerism doesn't come into play as much, but certainly the cause getting to the checkbook. There's also a shift in the workplace. When the pandemic hit, it was odd, but we have another organization, the Greater Give, and that organization was getting calls, and I'm not sure about the Give Back Foundation. We were getting calls, and there was a shift toward employers wanting to set up crisis funds for their own employee population, disaster funds, and in some rare instances, you might have scholarships not being funded by the employer, but funded by a campaign within the company. And it's where there's a shift to create community within that workplace where you're helping each other out. And there's more connective tissue to my workplace peer. And that's where employers are using that as a means to get employees engaged. As I said, local United Way, work closely with them. Direct engagement is a shift out of the workplace. Support for corporations. Corporations are really looking for help in shared responsibility efforts, volunteerism, and resourcing into the major gifts. Another area I'd like to speak of briefly is the tailwinds and headwinds in the legislation. So the major tax changes that happened with the Tax Cut and Jobs Act under President Trump as the largest reform in 3 decades. And when they raised the standard deduction, taking away a lot of those incentives. I think some of that is coming into play here as we go forward, especially for the average donor or the workplace donor, or what would be the everyday philanthropist. So there's been, over the last 3-4 years, 5 to 6 pieces of legislation have been floating around in Congress. One of them got into some of the pandemic relief with the universal deduction. It's now being reintroduced because that was sunset, but 47 million people took advantage of that deduction. It's being reintroduced under the Charitable Act. That still has legs, bipartisan support. There's also the opportunity to provide pre-tax flexible giving account. There's a piece of legislation out there that my wife Patty, part of our active philanthropy, had put together and funded and produced and got it introduced in about 3 Congresses. That's bipartisan support, Senate and House. But in that case, that would be very impactful if that were to come into play, because the workers, the employees, the associates inside the federal government, like in the private sector, would be able to have that payroll deduction for their giving on a pre-tax basis, very similar to what you see with parking, daycare, transit, healthcare, those types of expenses. So that has not been reintroduced yet in this Congress. It's been holding that back a little bit, but it is still in play. Other legislation, going back to the DAFs, that has not resurfaced, but there was some legislation because there was concern about if DAFs sit on large sums and the money doesn't get out, it's not getting put to work. So there was a Accelerated Charitable Efforts Act. However, that has not resurfaced, even though that had bipartisan support and had the House and the Senate. And lastly, one of the things that we're seeing still is the nonprofit community is still getting pandemic relief off of the ARPA. The concern there is, while that's billions of dollars that are still going out, that's going to come down here in 2026. So if that falls off, plus the drop in the donor, if that trend continues on its path, the nonprofit community and the beneficiaries of their services are going to be hurting from that standpoint. So tying back to the CCA for a moment, I think the movement with the CCA relative to the multi-channels, relative to tying to disaster, the different means to give, I think is following a lot of what we're seeing in the private sector workforce. Inside the federal government, you might have different programs going on in agencies that act like funds that support their own workforce, which is similar to what we're seeing in the private sector as well, when I mentioned crisis funds and some of those things. And I think promoting that mobile app is one way to go, but as the TASC supporting the Give Back Foundation as a CCA, we aren't able to do too much there, but I think we can maybe be a stronger partner with the OCs and the other contractors and the CFC to come up with strategies and support maybe promotion of that device, again, to meet that donor where they're at. So those are some observations. I hope I generally hit the mark for you, Tony. I'll turn it back to you. You can determine whether you take questions now or later. Thank you for the opportunity.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Dan. And I've been trying to track some of the questions, but we'll come back to questions in a minute. But before we turn to our third presenter, Rosie Allen Herring from the United Way of the National Capital Area, I know she has a short video that, Elizabeth, if you could run the United Way video.
This year, we ask our friends and neighbors to imagine for a moment what life would be like if you were unsure of how you would pay your rent, mortgage, or utility bills next month. For the Alice population, this is an everyday reality, and many of our neighbors are forced to make tough financial choices daily due to the rising cost of living. The ALICE, which stands for Asset Limited, Income Constrained, and Employed population, represents thousands of low to moderate income individuals and families in our region that earn just a little more than the federal poverty level, but less than the basic cost of living for the county and state in which they live. We all know ALICE. They may be a friend, a relative, a coworker, or a neighbor. ALICE households span all races, ages, ethnicities, and abilities. And Alice lives here in the National Capital Area. There is power in numbers. Collectively, we can change the odds and build a community that is stronger, more compassionate, and that meets the needs of our Alice neighbors so that they can live a better life and contribute to advancing the region.
Thank you for that, Rosie. We'll turn it to you.
Thank you so much, Tony, and thank you for this opportunity to simply share with all of our colleagues across this screen. And so thank you to Woodrow and Dan as well for sharing your information. And Dan, my good friend Renee Moe over at United Way of Dade County, I will certainly let her know that you and I have had this opportunity to be together. So what I wanted to do and share with you today is just to share a little bit brief information, but also to play on what Woodrow and Dan have already shared with you, because the numbers do mean something, the trends do mean something, and also it's an opportunity to ensure that we hear from you around what you'd like to see and what motivates you when you think about your philanthropy. For us at United Way of the National Capital Area, and yes, we cover the bulk of the Washington metropolitan area, and we know that there's a huge federal workforce presence here in this region. We want to ensure that we are creating not only equitable society, but we also want to ensure that we're looking at everything from health to economic stability to education as a means for looking at those strategic pillars that we know so many in our community care about. We also want to know that your United Way of the National Capital Area, and we know that wherever you may be, with I think over 200 individuals on this call today, you will have more than likely a United Way in your region. So when we talk about ALICE, which we introduced on the video, ALICE is simply an acronym that stands for Asset Limited, Income Constrained, and Employed. It's simply those who may be working every day. It could be even some of our federal workforce, some of our colleagues on a day-to-day basis who are going to work, doing their best. But if you happen to live in a high-cost area, such as what we have here in the National Capital area, it's simply saying that we recognize that sometimes the ends simply don't meet. And when we think about that for our region, there are over 500,000, over 500,000 families that fall into that category across this region. And we know that some are even a part of this federal workforce. What we found traditionally, when we look at the trends and we look at the data, ALICE families have traditionally been sort of kind of not so much overlooked, but undercounted, simply because what we look for generally in philanthropy, we look at the safety net. We look for someone who has already had a challenge or may already be in a crisis mode. By focusing on the ALICE population, we hope to prevent many from having that one emergency that will then take them from sufficiency and sustainability to finding themselves in crisis. So we know that when we look at the federal poverty guidelines, and I know Woodrow would know this as the data person, many of those guidelines are the guidelines that have been used since the 1960s. So we know that the federal poverty line that's saying it's, let's say it's here, when we know it's really here, because this is simply where salaries are, and it doesn't mean because you're above the federal poverty line that you can still make ends meet, especially again in high cost areas. We know that ALICE is in our region. We know we see it every day, and it's therefore if you have a child care issue, a health issue. We understand what happened during the pandemic and how we had to evolve over the last 3 years, because to some, we're still very much in that emergency. When we think about what happened during the pandemic, we all saw that, and no one had a crystal ball to see COVID coming. And then once we found ourselves in the moment, no one could have anticipated that it would last as long as it has. And so when we think about it, I call it the evolution of COVID-19. At first, it was simply, oh my goodness, our children are out of school because we're now working remotely. And when we thought about it, we became aware that many of our children, the only nutritious meal that they were receiving was at school. Then we became aware, oh, now it's distance learning, and what does this mean? What if some of our children already had academic needs for support even before going to distance learning? We then evolved, okay, we now know that our children have needs. Then we evolved as the pandemic started to go on and became a healthcare crisis. We started talking about first responders. We started talking about what they meant. We then, came to understand how critical they are, no matter where you are in the healthcare spectrum. I don't care if you were a physician or a surgeon, or if you were the environmental engineer who needed to keep those hospitals clean in order to be able to make them continue to work. Because during that crisis, and we all know, hospitals don't close for lunch. They are 365 days a year, 24 hours a day. As we continue to evolve, then we saw the economic impact of the pandemic. We saw those who had jobs that weren't able to distance, to work remotely. We saw so many in our midst that had to go to work because they may be hourly employees, and they simply, if they don't go, they can't get paid. And we also saw just here in the metropolitan area where there's so much tourism that's part of our industry, if you will, where they were not able to go to work. And so if you weren't having that hotel open, those workers did not get those wages, and those wages are not recoverable. And so as we continue to evolve, you saw then the economic impact of what it meant. And we again saw this even with some of our federal government workers as well. And so I think about, if you're not in the office, who's missing you? And we know that there are on the first floor of some of your buildings, we know that they're secure, but sometimes it's the local coffee shop. It's the dry cleaners. It's the cobbler that sometimes downstairs, when we are not in our offices, they don't get those typical customers. They are losing those wages as well. So we can see that there is a cyclical effort when it comes to where crisis hits us. And in this particular instance, it was something that hit everyone. COVID had absolutely no barrier to who it touched. And so we've all been impacted by it in some shape, form, or fashion. So what are we talking about when we say the data points? When we look at what the Bureau of Labor Statistics shared with us from 2021 to 2022, the wages in the private sector rose 5.5%, while wages for federal employees rose 3.4%. We recognize that that's a divide, even with just who we're talking to on this phone. It shows that those likely disparities are more than likely could have some of our federal workforce as Alice families as well. Those insecurities are not immune for federal workforce as they are in the private sector. It's also when we look at our local governments and the municipalities that are there that we see no matter what city or state or county that we're in, we recognize that even for some of our federal workforce, and as your United Way, we've watched, as you do too, every year when we get to the budget for the federal government. And we hope by December, if we can't get Congress to agree, will there be a continuing resolution? Can we kick the can down the road? Will we ever get that? And we've experienced that here, as I know you have as well, when there have been actual government shutdowns. Well, again, for many of our workforce, we recognize and we see you as well. And we know that sometimes missing a paycheck or two can have all of us thinking about what do we do and what significant family decisions we have to make. So you're asking, Rosie, why are you sharing all of this? What is this about? It's simply to say that not only do we recognize what you all mean as a federal workforce being a phenomenal partner to your United Way here in the National Capital Area, you are a large part of who we are as a region, but also we need you. We need you as we think about the philanthropy that has to occur. And we want you to know that philanthropy is not just at a large level. I think that Woodrow used the term of everyday philanthropist. And in doing so, what we're saying is everyone can do something. And we simply ask that you continue to go on this journey with us, but also help us understand how we can be of support to you. We know that when it comes to the combined federal campaign, that you've been able to do a phenomenal amount of giving, but also we know that there are still needs beyond those resources that we know we have. So if you haven't thought about it, but the fact that you're on today says that at least you're going to think about it, please know that there are communities, that there are individuals, there are families, and certainly there are nonprofits who are doing great work, who simply need that additional support in order to be able to move and build a thriving community. We want you to be a part of that collective. We want you to be a part of that journey. We want you to be a part of that partnership. So I want to encourage as many hosts as possible who are on here today. If you can have CFC events, please do so. If you can bring not-for-profits to the table to help them understand and share not only the impact that they're having, so that you as a donor can understand not only where your funds go, but also the impact and the accountability that we all have to be good stewards of what's been entrusted to us. We know that the CFC campaigns offer employees a number of ways to give, and I've been watching in the chat. There are a couple of individuals that were asking about a paper pledge card. They were asking how to access the system. Can someone walk them through it? And I know that you have colleagues who are champions for this work and ambassadors throughout our federal workforce that will help you do that. But I also want you to understand that on the back end, with Woodrow and his data to help us all see where the dollars need to go and the impact that we need to have, but with Dan also being able to help facilitate that with and through you, we know that we can indeed make a difference. So I'll simply end with saying, you know, the CFC has had a long history of supporting the community. You have done a great work. You have given generously, and even in times of where we would not necessarily think that you have it to give, it doesn't matter how much. This is about us coming together collectively as a community to say we simply care. As we think about the future, we hope to encourage you, but also we hope to simply engage with you, because this is a journey. And we know that the ills of society and the challenges that exist simply won't be resolved today. But we hope by sharing with you not only the data, but the how. And now you can hopefully see the impact you will now not only feel more encouraged to do so in terms of supporting your local CFC, but also you'll feel not only that sense of obligation, but that sense of simply caring for community. I'm grateful to each and every one of you. Your United Way of the National Capital Area will contend, and you have my commitment to ensure that we're the best partner that we can be with and for you on this journey. Thank you to Tony. Thank you, Woodrow and Dan, for letting me be a part of this panel with you. And thank you to each and every one of our colleagues who happen to be on this call, whether you are a CFC manager, ambassador, champion for this work, or you just happen to come on and you're thinking about what you care about and what you may want to support. We can guarantee you that collectively we will be that partner for you on this journey. So thank you for your time and your interest for today. And I hope for our colleague who's on the West Coast with the Pacific time, we'll have a chance to be back in with us as well. Thank you so much, Tony.
Thank you very much, Rosie. Also, I really appreciate the enthusiasm you bring to a very serious topic. As you've seen over the last 3 years, some of your, best donors knocking on your door for services that they need from the United Way and all the member charities you've got. We do have about 10 minutes to take some questions. We just posted a handout from Rosie in the chat box. And so, I encourage you all to pull that down. And just want to scroll back here. There were some questions about, how does the CFC giving system work? That kind of goes a little bit beyond what we can do here, but we'll look at see if there's a way we could tie some of that in, tack something like that on to the end of the day on Wednesday or Thursday or in the second week of the training for anybody who wants to have a live demo of how that system works. Chris, there was a question on the QR code for the mobile or paper form. We will have new materials for the CFC coming out this summer and fall. So there will be a QR code on the CFC documents. And later this week, there's going to be a marketing presentation on that as well. So scroll back up these questions here.
Tony, I see a couple of different, at least comments from, I think it's May Jen Howard, who's an outreach coordinator. I think she asked she said, there really seems to be a dependency on the agency. And she also made another comment about the PDF that's available online. And I will certainly share, May Jen, with our United Way colleagues in other cities and other markets, our video that they can share with you that can be also personalized for them. That footage is all here locally in the Washington metropolitan area, but we'll share it as well.
Great, thank you, thank you.
There's another one, just a comment from Bruce. I'm sorry, maybe I'm scrolling fast, where he does make the point that all of us have been Alice at one point or another. And I think that that is true. May-Jen certainly co-signed onto that. And it simply says that all of us sometimes are at different points in our careers as well as in our lives and that of our families. And none of us are immune. And again, as I said, with COVID, you would think that it was just not something that only impacted a certain segment of our society. It impacted each and every one of us, and having a challenge can do the same. So thank you.
And Tony, I'll just mention, Dan was talking about questions about how the trends break down by like size of donor and other contributors. I put a link to the Fundraising Effectiveness Project dashboards there that has some of those breakdowns. And also it's worth noting that both that and Giving USA numbers are not adjusted for inflation. So when we talk about being down 2% on individual donations to nonprofits, or 6% on the Giving USA numbers, that is not including 5, 6, 7% inflation. So the actual picture for organizations is even more challenging than that.
Yeah, I agree, Woodrow. It was the most recent Giving USA that, yeah, it was 3.4 on the individual that was down. If you adjusted for inflation, it's more like 10.5.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it beats that. And yeah, in consuming some of the information, I also see what I think the organization you were referring to saw. The small donors, they come in, they drop out easy. If you're a little more up in your regular donation, if you come on hard times, you might dial down.
That's right.
You stay with us, and we can continue to invoke you. The problem is those people that are acquired, it's like almost like a mortality rate that's high in that first. If you can get them from a 1-2 year into 3, you've got a greater chance that they're going to stay. But if they come in low and soft, then they're easy to drop out. And I think that's a common trend across. And
it is 100%. I think the only opportunity where you get the opposite effect is with recurring and whether it's credit card or payroll deduction, where you can get someone in at a lower price point, but by its nature retains a lot better. And I think that that's under leveraged by organizations overall. And it's a good time for that now too, when you've got donors who might be more likely to be price sensitive, but still want to make a difference.
And through the CFC, their organizations can download the list of people who did release their names. So this summer, we've got a couple of months before the active campaign starts. So to re-engage those people who gave you their names last year, may be able to help bring them back and retain them. Because if we have to replace 40 to 60% of our donors who churn every year, it gets harder and harder, and it's more time sensitive and financially burdensome to attract new donors every year than to get people to come back and repeat.
That's really important, Tony. I mean, that we've got that dual issue of we need to boost acquisition. Retention is also really weak, and I think that organizations are fighting a couple of trends. One is this over-indexing on large donor stewardship because of kind of a fear of competition or just immediate extreme need of the organization to get short-term money in. But that over-indexing has really led to this lack of resilience. But also this idea that we shouldn't be engaging as much, that this fear of over-solicitation is a huge mistake. And, if you think your message to your supporters is going to be an unwelcome, burdensome solicitation, you're probably right. But the answer isn't talk to them less. The answer is find more ways to engage them, right? Thinking back to the fact that the person you're talking to is a generous person who gives in their community in many ways, and they're looking for opportunities to get involved. So if your message isn't always the same, it isn't always a solicitation, it gives you that opportunity to make them feel like they're part of your mission, to engage them much more frequently, including, yes, asking them more often for donations, but also other things. And we need to do more of that. And we can't wait until the campaign starts. We have to start now to build that broad base of support so that we have it as an asset as we get into our campaign period. And that's true for the CFC, and it's true for just the nonprofit sector across the board. We have to start acting now. We can't afford to wait.
Absolutely.
I think you're seeing some hints in the positive movement in the retiree population about that recurring. And I think it'd be cool to kind of peel that onion back and see Okay, were these people giving on a regular basis? And then they made the transition off of their W-2 paycheck onto the annuity platform, because that could be a real promising sign if we do those touches that Woodrow and Tony are talking about. And then you get that longer term sustainable, because I think the mindset is different. You've got your income as a W-2 wage earner. When you get to that retirement, it's still income. It's annuity income, but your mindset is different. You're starting to give off of your total assets, you're saving, you work so hard, you now feel like, hey, I can do something. So I think there's opportunities, both that and the volunteer hours was a great, that was an executive order that was signed by President Obama, which I think was beneficial. Now the question is how much hay can we make with that for the campaign to help us improve sustainability and total dollars?
100%.
Absolutely. Well, I know we're at 4 o'clock, and I think, Elizabeth, are we going to be breaking into other groups, or are we going to stay right here to continue the Q&A?
Yes, so we had 2 sessions today. So what I recommend is anyone who has questions related to this particular session on Workplace Given, please remain in this main room. And if you have any questions for the earlier session on CFC 101, I have created a breakout room of which you have the option to join. It'll take place for the next 15 minutes. And I will go ahead and open all those rooms now, unless you have any questions, Tony.
No, you can open the other room. I was just going to, as people go there, I was just going to scroll back. There was a question from Jennifer. When a donor indicates that they want an acknowledgement, does the system require they put in contact information? Yes, it does. And they have the option to release that to charities. So we do give them some reminders and some gentle prodding, but it is an opt-in system. So most donors will be anonymous unless they opt in to give you their name for that acknowledgement. But once you get that name, I encourage charities to use them. Stay in touch with people and cultivate them. They don't just want to hear from us once a year. When I used to work for United Way, we had a term called annualitis. We didn't want to suffer from annualitis. Woodrow, question for you from Tom Price. He's asking, are large donors individuals or institutions when you were talking about them?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Those are large individual donors. So that's not any institutional giving in those figures.
Yeah, you've got Woodrow, you got your megas, the Bill and Melinda Gates and that kind of stuff. But even that gets clouded because is that an individual or is that their foundation? But
yeah, 100%.
Your large donor would be just people who have assets of substantial nature, income, and they're just on the larger end of the spectrum.
That's
Correct.
exactly right. And also it's worth noting that we deliberately remove major outliers. So Mackenzie Scott is not in our data set for a reason. And that if you that's a whole other analysis, but we're kind of looking at that. And likewise, and it's one of the reasons why Giving USA numbers and ours are slightly different, directionally the same, but often a little bit different, is that our cutoff is organizations that are raising no more than 25 million a year in donations. And so in a situation where we are now, where you've got the top end driving a lot of the decline, the Giving USA individual numbers look a little bit worse than ours do.
Mm-hmm. Rosie, there's a question about the definition of ALICE. And the question is, seniors who might be retired and are not employed, would you consider them falling outside your formal definition of ALICE, or would retirees be in that mix?
Retirees can absolutely be in there. Anyone who basically has income and where the income is simply not meeting the needs is what we consider to be ALICE. again, it's seniors, it's those who may be differently abled, it's any number of individuals who simply live in a or have income that simply doesn't allow them to meet all their needs.
Thank you. Thank you. And there, again, in the chat, there were several questions about the pledge form and materials. So later this week, there is a presentation on the 2023 CFC marketing. There will be a paper pledge form, and hopefully we'll see this year whether the decline in those donors using a form was because they weren't in the office to get it, or what. So as we re-engage, as people return to work, we'll certainly be making paper forms available in those offices that want them and need them. We may not see the EPA needing those forms, or the Department of Commerce or Energy, but the post office, the TSA, military, probably all will. So I would just say stay tuned. Marketing presentation is coming, and materials will be available for you later this summer. Lots of positive comments on your video, Rosie. So we'll make sure we add that to the CFC virtual charity tour. Question from Alex, who is wondering if the loss of paper pledges is tied to the loss of the physical catalog. Again, I think we'll have to see that as this year approaches. Not sure if Woodrow or Dan, if you have any opinion on, forms as well as catalogs, but I think Woodrow, you were thinking, I think you said it's not just about the form, it's about the engagement.
Yeah, I think that, I remember actually being asked by the Gates Foundation what the most important technology is in workplace giving, and my answer was a clipboard. And the reason for that is because the technology can reduce friction, it can increase your reach, but the engagement is what's really critically important. And when we look at what's successful, it has to do with who's engaging whom in the workplace and what norms are being shown. Now, if it's difficult to give for whatever reason, that's a problem. It can suppress your result. But what's most important is how we engage, and is it compelling, and is there a sense of urgency? And then do you have a mechanism that works? And I think what we have here is we have to disambiguate that a little bit, right? We've got situations with workers where one approach might be more effective than another. Dan's point about mobile is really, really important because everybody's got a phone. But if we think we can just give someone a form on a phone and that's going to replace whatever other engagement is going on when someone's filling out a paper form, then we're probably missing a big opportunity. I definitely think there's lots of upside on mobile. The question is, how do you engage on mobile in a way that is meaningful?
Right. I was taught a long time ago, Woodrow, it's still people give to people. And it's just, there's that connective tissue. Now,
that's right.
You can replace some of the individual, shaking a hand, talking to people and asking and engaging with some of the tools, but the further away you get, it is a little more difficult. But I do think the remote workforce has caused a new dynamic. The paper pledge, I'm not sure where the question was going. Maybe the OC can, or one of the OCs can answer that, but I think the individual was wondering if the paper pledge goes the booklet. Well, there's different ways. I think there's a PDF with the charities listing, and you never know how people behave. They might want the paper pledge, carry it home, or maybe they just like it. It's hard to say, or they'll never convert to the app. But you got to have the two vehicles, the list of charities or a mechanism to search the charities, and you've got to have the input device for the pledge. And I think there's still a massive shift toward the technology there, but that stuff about the USPS, I think that's something we can maybe affect, but that agency behaves a certain way, it's my understanding.
I think that's exactly right. Yeah.
And Rosie, what do you see in the private sector between people who use an electronic means to give or people who use a traditional form or check to give? Are you seeing, I think when CFC reformed the rules back in 2016, we may have seen it as an either or situation. We were going to be in one box and we're all going to switch to another box. And I think where we're finding is we need to have a foot in both boxes.
Absolutely do. I mean, I think that, any not-for-profit or any organization that is not only soliciting donations, but open to receiving them will meet the donor wherever he or she is. You have to be nimble and flexible to be able to give a significant execution that makes it easy. The operative word is easy. If we make anything too complicated, if we have you jumping through hoops, even if it's online, multiple screens, what have you, not being able to get the answer that you need would make anyone potentially walk away, and they may or may not come back. And we still have donors who prefer to write a check. You're not going to turn that down. It's still legal tender. And so it's an opportunity for us all to simply recognize if you're meeting donors where they are, and we now have intergenerational donations, we simply will be able to offer what we consider to be a best-in-class execution to anyone who's chosen to invest in our work.
And Tony, I saw that there were some questions about cause area and size breakdowns for that link I shared, starting on page 18. There are breakdowns by organization size and cause. It's top level NTE, so it doesn't break down as far as, I know there was a question about veterans, that doesn't break down that granularly, unfortunately. But you can see the overall trends there by both sides. And what we see is that the small orgs, as asked, like small orgs, it's a lot more volatility. So when we have that indicator moves a lot more wildly with the overall results, tends to be directionally the same, although not always. Sometimes we have weird 2020 years. But it's the large organizations that show the biggest drop, and also because they represent the biggest component of the overall pool of funds. That's the biggest contributor to the downtrend as well.
Sure.
Woodrow, there was a question by Christine Kelly. It just pushed down in the chat. Has there been a survey of people who have dropped off, and have we asked them why? And I did mention that surveying of federal employees is tightly restricted by the government. But what data do you have that might help answer that?
Yeah, so a couple of things. So first of all, I think that, I've been talking to Tony, and I think there are some opportunities for us to get some good federal employee data by just surveying by geography. There are places that have such a high percentage of federal employee that we can probably get a pretty good sample that way. Nevertheless, we do, yes, we have some data. We see people ask. I think we have a couple of challenges with that data. One is people are wrong about why they didn't donate. And it's a kind of a fraught question to ask and get a decent answer from. What we do know is it appears that overall solicitation rates are down, and the number and the type of person who's getting asked to participate in nonprofit fundraising is getting more and more constrained. I think there are a number of trends driving that, but I think that seems to be the biggest driver of participation rates is just who's being invited to the party.
And I think, Woodrow, certainly one of the lessons I learned at the United Way in years was, what's the number one reason people give to charity? It's because they're asked by someone they know.
Yeah, exactly.
That when you use the word engagement, you're engaging, you're answering someone who needs help, or who knows someone who needs help. And I think Alexander asked a question. Has there been any analysis of communities of practice within federal departments? And I'm not aware of specific internal within federal departments, but certainly there's been a number of academic studies that have looked at, any number of questions. If we have more charities, will we raise more money? If we do that, and I think one of the things is, that I have read in some of the research and I'd love your reaction, Woodrow or Rosie, is, if you run a good campaign, you'll raise money.
Mhm.
It's not necessarily, an either or question. And it doesn't matter which presidential administration is. I think the question is, are we running a good campaign?
I think that there is always opportunity to do things differently and to recognize where there is greater opportunity. I don't believe that I believe we do have a good campaign. I don't think it's perfect. And I think that we have, opportunities to look at not only how we execute in terms of, again, some of the questions that were on here today. How do I get the catalog? How do I try to match my own personal preference to what the opportunities are? Can we share information that may help people to understand what the needs are in their local community? Do we have a good execution that is cost effective for any donor to recognize or be able to do it sooner, quicker, faster, easily? And how do we communicate with one another to say, do you know how your dollars have helped X, Y, and Z? So I think there's always opportunity. It's one thing on the back end in terms of an infrastructure to say that we can run a good campaign, we can do certain things in our sleep. Your United Way has been doing this for a long time, but we have to continue to evolve because the donor of the future and the donor of now is very different than the donor was 5 years ago, 10 years ago, and certainly even longer. We recognize that our workforce is very different as it becomes younger. They want an easier execution. It may be on the phone. It may not be with a pledge card. They may not stay in a federal government workforce for 30 or 40 years. We have to meet them where they are. And many of our young people have developed their personal passions when they were simply teenagers because no one graduates from high school without volunteer service hours. So they already know what they like, and that simply carries them through the remainder of their collegiate life and certainly through their career. So it's a matter of how do we ensure that we evolve to meet the needs and make it easier and just painless for our donors to not only fulfill their commitment to commit to community, but also be a good part of this trusted workforce for our public.
Okay. Well, I want to thank everyone, Rosie, Woodrow, Dan. We're getting some nitty-gritty questions. So I'm going to talk to Elizabeth and Curtis about maybe having a little breakout on our nitty-gritty process. So for people who want to see how that works, we could spend time tomorrow, but not right now. But we'd be happy to demonstrate some of how that works later on. But I think you've given us a lot to think about. I think as the training progresses, we're going to be able to drill down to a lot of tactical execution. To Rosie, to your point, we have a good campaign, we got to do better. And, I think part of this training is to, get us to do a better job in 2023 as people come back to work. But you've given us a lot of food for thought as we get started on this year. So I appreciate your preparation, your enthusiastic delivery, and your willingness to answer questions. So we look forward to connecting with people tomorrow in tomorrow's sessions and go from there. But we appreciate your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right.
Thank you, Tony.
All right.
Tony.
Have a great afternoon.
You too.